an unfettered, dangerous corporation. And of course, the entire pharmaceutical industry is suspect, as we know. But I wanted to talk about, in particular, Purdue Pharmaceutical, which is now Purdue Pharma. This was basically founded by Arthur Sackler, and you may have heard about the Sackler family. They give to everyone, and they're held in great esteem, and they don't really connect themselves very well publicly to Purdue Pharmaceutical because it's privately held, but in fact they are the owners, the family that owns it. Arthur started out back in 1942 when he was in medical school. He found out that he was on the paper and he could make an extra $5, which in 1942 was a lot of money, by putting an ad for Chesterfields in the local paper. And he suddenly became fascinated by the power of advertising. He was also studied under a disciple of Freud, so that he became very attuned to how we can tweak the emotional strings in people and get them to respond to advertising. He then started working for a copywriting job at a film, William Douglas McAdams, which is a advertising firm, and he was so proficient and so effective at his job, he ended up owning the firm. And this firm was the leader in developing the techniques that are used across the pharmaceutical industry today. He found that you need to talk to the doctors in the proper way to sell them, and talk to the public in the proper way to sell them. And all these techniques are being used to this day by the pharmaceutical industry to penetrate the market with drugs, in many cases of questionable validity. Then they purchased a small company, the family did, made over-the-counter drugs called Purdue Pharmaceutical, and they proceeded to finance some research in which they developed the first time-release artificial opiate, and which was OxyContin. And again, they utilized their techniques that he had not only to advertise it, but before that, they influenced the FDA to approve this at a time when opiates had been used by doctors for over 100 years, but only for terminal patients or people in extreme cancer pain. And they knew that it was a dangerous drug and not to use it for any other purpose. And they convinced the FDA to approve it for neck pain, for back pain, for toothaches, for whatever. As a result of that, over 200,000 people have died of opiate overdoses in this country. 65,000 people died in 2016. And 4/5 of the people who are on heroin today started out with prescription opiates. So, and today the Sackler family is worth about $13 billion. So I think this is a good example of a scourge corporation. There are many other corporations we can name that have a lot of effects negatively on our population. The one that's in the news most recently is guns and the NRA, with about 33,000 deaths a year. We've got almost 500,000 deaths a year due to tobacco still. Fossil fuels, we've got about 200,000 early deaths a year from the fossil fuel industry. The food industry, we don't really know how well it feeds into the death rate, but we do know that they have developed over the years a lot of very addictive foods that are made from subsidized grains that are in general very unhealthy. And we also have the for-profit prisons, and we have about 4.4% of the world's population, but we have 22% of the world's prisoners. Part of the reasons that number is so high is for economic reasons. Judges have been influenced to put more people in jail to fill them up and so on. And then it turns out that minorities are easier to pick on. They don't take you to court and cause a lot of problems. They're more likely to cop a plea and not, clog up the system, so that the incarceration rate for blacks for example, drug use, even though both populations use it to about the same extent, is about 5 times that of whites. And part of the reason of that is economic, part of it is racist. Keep them repressed. And now we're seeing within the state of Florida the privatization for profit of K through 12 education, which is also a scourge in and of itself. What are the driving forces that are causing this to happen? Well, the obvious one is we've allowed monopolies to reform. Up until the mid-60s to late 60s, we were very strict. You had like 20 different oil companies, 20 different phone companies. Now they've all gotten back together again. And when they get back together and you form these monopolies or cartels, there's several bad things that happen. One of the things is that there's no competition, so therefore they can gouge customers. And one of the key political elements that is driving our politics and our emotional well-being of working families is the purchasing power of working families. And when you gouge people with a corporation, you basically are reducing their purchasing power. You're making something that they need, a drug or the phone line or whatever it may be, more expensive than it needs to be, and that's reducing their purchasing power. And that's a critical part of what's going wrong in our country. They also have undue leverage over their employees because they have no place else to go. If you're a phone worker and there's only one phone company, well, where are you going to go? And then finally, once they've gotten into this position where they have all these profits coming in, they can use their monopoly position and profits to unduly influence the government to make decisions in their favor and laws in their favor, which of course we're seeing right now. And we saw, for example, the corruption of the oversight department for the oil well drilling that was happening in the Gulf and the results of that those people were bought off in many different ways. Okay, now we'll talk about fixing it briefly. These are my suggestions after thinking about it for a long time. The first element which gates everything, which gets into move to amend, obviously, is take back citizen control of government. And I've thought a lot about how to get there from here. And I feel there's an interim step, which involves a pledge that people who are running for office would be asked to sign. But what it really boils down to, in the helicopter view, is that at some point the majority in Congress, in the Senate, have to give the minority more power. And the particular power they have to give them is the right to, in a limited manner, but the right to bring legislation to the floor for discussion and voting. And what this does is it forces the entire body of legislators to show their true allegiances. Which you say, we're going to vote on disclosure of all campaign contributions, okay? Well, everyone's got to put their name on the line. Are you in favor of disclosing, or are you against it? If you're against it, why? And why should I vote for you next time around if you're against it? Are you in favor of background checks for guns? Are you in favor, you'll recall that when they were trying to kill health care, they canceled a whole bunch of votes because they didn't want this to look bad for people that they were voting to kill healthcare until they thought they maybe would make it, and then McCain killed it at the end, but they thought they had it in their grasp. So that's the only time they allowed that vote to happen and to put people on the record. And this forces people to go on the record. And I don't mind giving that kind of power to a minority. I've had people tell me, well, if the Democrats take over in January, why should we give more power to the Republicans? And I'm saying, well, we got to start somewhere, because until the majority gives the minority this power, I'm not sure we're ever going to get there. So that's the first thing. The second obvious thing is we got to go back to breaking up monopolies. And there's two kinds of monopolies. There's ones that are what I call natural monopolies. And these are, in general, things that involve using easements. There's some other natural monopolies like police forces and fire and so on, but most of them involve easements. So your electric service, your cable service, your sewer service, your roads, your airports and so on. These are all easements that are given by the government to say, okay, we're giving you this piece of land to use for this special purpose. And all of those, I believe, should be owned and controlled by the government, not necessarily the federal government, maybe municipal government, and so on. One way let me just give you one specific example for this so you can understand it. Your power lines, right now they're owned by the power company, but they use easements that were given to them by the government. And when you get your bill, you get one bill for transmission and another bill for generation. Well, I'm saying the transmission part should be run by the government. And in fact, if you go to Orlando or Tallahassee, you'll find out they have municipal power systems that are owned by the government. And you'll also find out that they have loads of solar power on roofs because of that. Because they're not competing with they don't worry about who's generating the power. So you would have the distribution system operated by the state or the local, municipal, whatever, and the people that are providing power to the grid and using it would compete and I have no problem with competition. I think capitalism is a wonderful thing when you have multiple companies competing on an arm's length basis. That's what built the whole structure we have. I don't want to throw the baby out in the bathwater, but when it gets corrupted so that competition goes away and undue influence is made, then it's a whole different story. So, one of the other things we need to do, and I know I'm going to get arguments about how to do this, but we need to clean up the media. We need to break up the media monopolies. There was a time, for example, a paper could only own one TV station and one radio station. Now we got Sinclair owning all the radio stations. It's totally, or not all, but bulk of them. We need to return to the fairness doctrine for political speech on the TV, which you may or may not be familiar with. And then this last one, which is people are going to say, how do you do this? But I think there's ways of doing it. We need to have some kind of a media truthfulness tagging. So when you see something, it has a little truthfulness tag attached to it about how much you should believe in this. And I think you could do this using a majority vote of some trusted measures. Okay, like you could have all the newspapers get together and generate one trusted measure. And you can have Snopes be one trusted measure. You could have the historians at all the colleges make up, I don't know, somehow, and then you have these entities vote, and if a majority of these say this thing is suspect, it gets tagged as suspect. We need some type of media tagging. So, now the last and not least by far of this, and if you want I could go into more detail on this, is we need to improve the allocation of corporate gross profits between what portion goes to wages and what portion goes to earnings. For that, the reason I talked about automation, we see that that's forcing the workers to have less and less and less, and the businesses have more and more and more. Well, businesses are sitting on trillions of dollars of cash they don't know what to do with, and the workers are starving. That's not working out too well. So I've come up with some ways to do this, which I think would be workable, and I'd be happy to talk about those in details.